The crumpled boarding pass felt like a small death in Sarah Mitchell's trembling fingers. Gate A12 stretched empty before her, the last passengers disappearing into the jetway like smoke. Her flight to Boston, the flight that would take her home to her 8-year-old daughter, Emma, had just sealed its doors. The departure board blinked mockingly. Departed 6:47 p.m. She was exactly 11 minutes too late. 11 minutes that felt like a lifetime when your child was lying in a hospital bed 3,000 miles away, asking why Mommy wasn't there yet. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of airport desperation that made even the strongest people feel utterly alone. But Sarah had been alone for so long now that this feeling was almost familiar. Sarah sank into seat chattered 23C at gate A15, her phone pressed against her ear like a lifeline. The plastic chair creaked under her weight, and she could smell the lingering scent of coffee and anxiety that seemed to permeate every airport waiting area. "I know, baby, I know," she whispered into the phone, her voice thick with exhaustion and guilt. "Mommy's flight got delayed, but I'm going to be on the very next one, okay? Mrs. Rodriguez is going to stay with you tonight, and I'll be there when you wake up." Emma's small voice crackled through the speaker, congested from the fever that had spiked just as Sarah was boarding her connecting flight in Chicago. A stomach bug, the doctor had said. Nothing serious, but Emma was scared and alone, and Sarah was trapped in an endless cycle of delayed flights and cancelled connections. The storm system that had swept through the Midwest wasn't just disrupting air travel, it was tearing apart her carefully constructed life, one cancelled flight at a time. "Tell me the story about the brave princess again," Emma asked, her voice so small and distant that Sarah's heart clenched. This was their ritual, their connection across the impossible distance that work demanded. Sarah worked for Morrison & Associates, one of Boston's most prestigious law firms, and the Chicago client meeting she'd just finished could secure her partnership track. But sitting in this sterile airport, listening to her daughter's labored breathing, none of it seemed to matter. "Once upon a time," Sarah began, her voice steadying as she fell into the familiar rhythm, "there was a princess who had to travel very far from her castle." She told the story while watching other travelers hurry past, businessmen with expensive luggage, families with crying babies, elderly couples moving slowly hand in hand. Everyone had somewhere to be, someone waiting for them. The universality of it should have been comforting, but instead it made her feel even more isolated in her particular brand of single-parent exhaustion. After Emma finally fell asleep, Sarah hung up and stared at the departure board. The next flight to Boston wasn't until 6:30 the following morning. 12 hours in this airport, 12 hours of waiting while her daughter needed her. She pulled out her laptop, thinking she might as well work, but the screen remained black as she sat there, paralyzed by a familiar cocktail of guilt and helplessness. The waiting area was mostly empty now, just a few other stranded passengers scattered among the rows of connected chairs. A janitor pushed his cart slowly past, the wheels squeaking rhythmically. The overhead announcement system crackled to life every few minutes with updates about delayed flights and gate changes, but Sarah barely heard them anymore. She was thinking about Emma's fever, about the partnership meeting she'd probably blown by leaving early, about the rent that was due next week, and the grocery shopping she hadn't done. It was then, as she shifted uncomfortably in the rigid airport chair, that she felt something unusual beneath her fingers, something that shouldn't have been there. She looked down and saw the edge of what appeared to be an envelope, carefully taped to the underside of her seat. Her first instinct was to ignore it. Airports were full of forgotten things, and she had enough problems without getting involved in someone else's mystery. But curiosity won, and she carefully peeled away the tape. The envelope was ordinary white paper with "For the parent who needs this" written in careful handwriting across the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, and as Sarah unfolded it, She realized she was holding something that would change everything she thought she knew about coincidence, kindness, and the invisible threads that connect strangers in their darkest moments. The letter began simply, "If you're reading this, then you're probably having one of those days where being a single parent feels impossible." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The handwriting was masculine, steady, but there was something vulnerable about the careful formation of each letter. She glanced around the empty gate area, suddenly aware that she might not be as alone as she thought. Someone had been here before her, someone who understood exactly what she was feeling, someone who had taken the time to reach across the void with a message of connection. But as she continued reading, Sarah realized this wasn't just a random act of kindness. This letter knew things about her life that no stranger should know. 3 weeks ago, her coffee order at the Starbucks in Terminal B had been mysteriously paid for when she'd been frantically searching for her wallet while Emma waited on the phone. 2 months before that, someone had left exactly $47.32, the amount she'd been short for Emma's school field trip, in an envelope in her mailbox with no return address. And just last month, when her car had broken down in the grocery store parking lot, a tow truck had appeared within minutes, claiming the service had already been paid for. Sarah had attributed all of these incidents to remarkable luck or the kindness of strangers. But now, sitting in this airport chair with trembling hands, she was beginning to understand that luck might have had nothing to do with it. The letter continued. "My name is Michael Harrison, and I've been watching over you and Emma for the past 6 months. Before you call security or think I'm some kind of stalker, please keep reading. I have a story to tell you, and it starts 32 years ago with a man named David Mitchell and a woman named Grace Harrison." Sarah's vision blurred. David Mitchell was her father's name. Her father, who had disappeared when she was 6 years old, leaving behind only debt and broken promises. Her father, who she hadn't spoken to in over 15 years, who didn't even know he had a granddaughter. The paper rustled in her shaking hands as the pieces of an impossible puzzle began to click into place. "Grace Harrison was my mother," the letter continued, "and your father was the love of her life." The airport around Sarah seemed to dissolve into white noise. Travelers moved past her like ghosts, their conversations muffled by the rushing sound in her ears. She read the letter 3 times before the words began to make sense. And even then, they seemed to belong to someone else's life, someone else's story. But the details were too specific, too intimate to be anything but true. Michael Harrison had grown up knowing that his mother loved a man who had chosen his first family over them. Grace had never spoken bitterly about David Mitchell, never painted him as a villain. Instead, she had told her son stories about a brilliant, complicated man who had been torn between 2 worlds, 2 families, 2 sets of responsibilities that could never be reconciled. She had died 3 years ago, but not before making Michael promise that if he ever found David's other family, he would help them if they needed it. "I found you through your law firm's website," the letter explained. "The resemblance to the photos my mother kept was unmistakable. You have his eyes, Sarah, and when I learned you were a single mother struggling to balance career and parenthood, I knew what I had to do." Sarah felt sick and grateful and angry and confused all at once. Michael Harrison had been shadowing her life for months, paying for her coffee, covering her expenses, orchestrating small miracles that had made her difficult days marginally easier. He had been her guardian angel, but he was also the son of her father's other woman, the secret family that had torn her own family apart. The letter ended with an address and a phone number. "I'll be in Boston next week for work. If you want to meet, if you want to know more about our father, I'll be at Café Luna on Newbury Street every day at noon. I'll understand if you choose not to come, but Emma has family she doesn't know about, and I thought you might want to give her that choice." Sarah sat in the airport chair for another hour, reading and rereading the letter until she had memorized every word. The next flight to Boston wouldn't board for another 10 hours. But suddenly those hours felt like both an eternity and not nearly enough time to process what she had learned. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rodriguez. "Emma's fever broke. Sleeping peacefully? Don't worry." For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she might not have to carry everything alone. Michael Harrison sat in his hotel room in downtown Boston, staring at his phone and wondering if he had made a terrible mistake. The letter he had left at O'Hare was just one of dozens he had placed in airports, coffee shops, and other locations where stressed parents might find them. But this one was different. This one contained information that could explode both their lives or bring them together in ways that might honor his mother's memory. He had been watching Sarah Mitchell for 6 months, learning her patterns, her struggles, her small victories. He knew she took the red line to work every morning, bought her groceries at the Star Market on Cambridge Street, and called her daughter every day at 3:15 p.m. sharp. He knew she worked late most nights, survived on coffee and determination, and sang off key in her car when she thought no one was listening. What he didn't know was whether she would see his help as a gift or a violation, whether learning about Grace Harrison would bring her peace or open old wounds that had never properly healed. Michael had grown up with the story of David Mitchell as a cautionary tale about the complexity of love and duty, but Sarah had lived with the reality of abandonment and financial struggle. His phone rang at 11:30 p.m. The caller ID showed a Boston number he didn't recognize, but somehow he knew exactly who it was before he answered. "Is this Michael Harrison?" The voice was tired but strong, with an undertone of barely controlled emotion. "Yes, Sarah. I got your letter." There was a long pause, filled with the weight of 32 years of parallel lives. "I'm at Logan Airport. My flight was delayed, and I've been thinking all night about what you wrote." Michael closed his eyes, suddenly understanding the magnitude of what he had set in motion. "Are you angry?" "I don't know what I am," Sarah admitted. "Confused, grateful, overwhelmed. My daughter has been asking about her grandfather lately, and I've never known what to tell her. Grace used to say that family isn't just about blood," Michael said carefully. "It's about showing up for each other, especially when it's difficult." "You've been showing up for me for months, and I didn't even know you existed." Michael could hear the exhaustion in her voice, but also something else, a tentative hope that made his chest tight. "I wanted to help, but I wasn't sure how you'd react to learning about Grace and David. Their relationship was complicated." "My whole life has been complicated because of their relationship," Sarah said, but there was no bitterness in her voice. "I spent years angry at my father for leaving, but I never thought about what it might have cost him to stay with my mother when his heart was somewhere else." They talked for another hour, filling in the gaps between their parallel stories. Michael told her about Grace's kindness, her resilience, the way she had built a good life for them, despite the circumstances. Sarah shared memories of her father before he left, his gentleness, his intelligence, the way he used to read her bedtime stories with different voices for every character. "He used to call me his brave princess," Sarah said, and Michael smiled. "Grace called me her brave knight. She said that someday I would understand what that meant." When they finally hung up, both of them knew that Café Luna on Newbury Street would see 2 customers at noon the following week. But more than that, they knew that Emma Mitchell would grow up knowing she had an uncle who understood the weight of carrying other people's stories, and who had spent months proving that love could transcend the complicated legacy of their shared father. The next morning, Sarah's flight to Boston took off on time. As the plane lifted above the clouds, she looked out the window and thought about the invisible networks of connection that existed just beneath the surface of everyday life. Somewhere below, other single parents were struggling through difficult days, and maybe, just maybe, they would find letters of their own, small reminders that they weren't as alone as they thought. But for Sarah, the real journey was just beginning. She had spent years building walls around her heart to protect herself and Emma from further disappointment. Now she was about to meet someone who might help her understand that those walls didn't have to be permanent, that family could be both the source of our deepest wounds and our greatest healing. When the plane touched down at Logan, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Welcome home. Take care of yourself and Emma. M." She smiled and typed back, "See you next Tuesday at noon." Emma was already feeling better when Sarah arrived at their apartment in Cambridge, chattering excitedly about the Get Well card that had arrived that morning, signed "From a Friend" in the same careful handwriting Sarah now recognized. As she tucked her daughter into bed that night, Emma asked about the important meeting in Chicago. "Did you get the job you wanted, Mommy?" Sarah considered the question. She had missed the final partnership meeting when she'd left early for Emma's sake, and she still didn't know what consequences that decision might have. But sitting there in her daughter's room, with the letter from Michael Harrison folded carefully in her purse, she realized that some opportunities were more important than others. "I think I might have found something even better," she said. "How would you feel about meeting someone new, someone who knew your grandfather?" Emma's eyes widened with curiosity and excitement. "Really? What was he like?" Sarah smoothed her daughter's hair and smiled. "That's exactly what we're going to find out." Outside, Boston hummed with its usual late-night energy, but inside their small apartment, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The possibility that their story was expanding rather than contracting, that Emma might grow up with a richer understanding of where she came from and who she could become. The letter had been just the beginning. Tuesday arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that made Boston feel like a postcard. Sarah stood outside Café Luna at 11:45, watching through the window as early lunch customers settled into their tables. She had changed her outfit 3 times that morning, finally settling on a navy blue sweater and jeans, professional enough to feel confident, casual enough not to seem like she was trying too hard. Emma was at school, blissfully unaware that her mother was about to meet the uncle she'd never known existed. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "Morrison wants to see you at 2 p.m. about the Chicago situation." Her stomach clenched. She had been dreading this conversation all week, knowing that leaving the client meeting early had probably cost her the partnership track she'd worked toward for 5 years. But standing outside Café Luna, watching strangers laugh over coffee and pastries, she realized that some risks were worth taking. At exactly noon, a man walked up to the cafe entrance. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with dark hair that was starting to gray at the temples and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, and he moved with the careful confidence of someone who was used to being responsible for other people. When he saw Sarah through the window, he paused for just a moment, and she knew they were both seeing their father's features reflected in a stranger's face. Michael Harrison looked exactly like what Sarah had imagined her father might look like now, if he had lived to be 53 years old. The same strong jaw, the same thoughtful expression, the same way of holding his shoulders that suggested he carried weight he never talked about. When he smiled and raised his hand in a small wave, Sarah felt a jolt of recognition that went deeper than physical resemblance. They ordered coffee and found a table near the back, away from the lunch crowd, but close enough to the window that natural light softened the awkwardness of their first face-to-face meeting. For several minutes, they sat in the kind of silence that felt both comfortable and charged with possibility. "You look like him," Michael said finally. "Grace used to show me pictures, old ones from before. Well, before everything got complicated." "You do too," Sarah replied. "It's strange, isn't it? Looking at someone you've never met and seeing your own reflection." Michael nodded and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it he extracted a small photograph, black and white, edges soft with age. It showed a young man and woman sitting on a park bench, both laughing at something outside the frame. The woman had Michael's eyes and gentle smile. The man was unmistakably David Mitchell, but younger than Sarah had ever seen him, looking happy in a way she couldn't remember from her own childhood. "This was taken at the public garden," Michael said, sliding the photo across the table. 1991. They met there every Tuesday for 2 years, just talking. Grace said those were the happiest afternoons of her life. Sarah studied the photograph, trying to reconcile this joyful version of her father with the increasingly distant man who had eventually disappeared from her life entirely. "My parents were already having problems by then," she said quietly. "I remember a lot of arguments, a lot of doors slamming. I always thought it was my fault somehow." "Children usually do," Michael said with understanding that spoke from experience. "But Grace always said the situation was impossible from the beginning. David loved your mother when he married her, and he loved you completely. But he also loved Grace, and there wasn't room in his life for both families without destroying them all. So he chose to destroy us instead?" The words came out more bitter than Sarah had intended, and she immediately regretted them. But Michael didn't flinch. "I think he destroyed himself," Michael said simply. Grace heard from him one last time about 10 years ago. He was living in Seattle, working construction, alone. He said he thought about you and your mother every day, but he was too ashamed of what he'd done to reach out. Sarah felt tears threatening and took a sip of her coffee to steady herself. "I spent so many years being angry at him for leaving, but maybe staying would have been worse." "Grace used to say that love isn't always about making the right choice," Michael said. "Sometimes it's about making the choice you can live with." They talked for 2 hours, trading stories and filling in the gaps between their parallel lives. Michael told her about Grace's career as a librarian, her volunteer work at a literacy center, the way she had raised him to be proud of who he was while never speaking ill of the complicated circumstances that had brought him into the world. Sarah shared memories of her mother's strength, her determination to build a good life for them after David left, the way she had worked 2 jobs to put Sarah through college. "Grace would have loved Emma," Michael said when Sarah showed him pictures on her phone. "She always regretted not having more children, not being able to give me siblings. Emma's been asking about her grandfather lately," Sarah said. "She's at that age where she's starting to notice that other kids have extended families, grandparents who send birthday cards and show up to school plays." Michael hesitated, then pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a picture of a small girl with pigtails, maybe 5 years old, sitting at a piano bench with her hands positioned carefully on the keys. "This is Lily, my daughter. She's been taking piano lessons for 6 months now, and she's absolutely determined to play Carnegie Hall someday." Sarah stared at the photo, realizing that Emma had a cousin she'd never met, that their small family was suddenly larger and more complicated than she had ever imagined. "You're married?" "Divorced," Michael said with a rueful smile. 2 years now. Joint custody, very amicable. Jennifer and I realized we were better friends than spouses, but we're great co-parents. Lily spends weekends with me, and I've been thinking—" He paused, seeming to gather courage. "I've been thinking that maybe she and Emma might like to meet each other, if you're okay with that." The idea was overwhelming and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Sarah had spent 8 years protecting Emma from disappointment, from the possibility of being let down by people who might not stick around. But looking at Michael's careful, hopeful expression, she found herself considering what it might mean for Emma to have family who chose to be present instead of people who were obligated by blood alone. "Tell me about the letters," Sarah said suddenly. "Not just the one you left for me, but all of them. How long have you been doing this?" Michael's cheeks flushed slightly. "About 3 years, since Grace died. She made me promise that if I ever found David's family, I would help them if they needed it. But when I found you, I realized there might be other single parents out there who could use the same kind of support. He explained how he had started small, paying for a stranger's coffee when they looked particularly stressed, leaving anonymous gift cards at daycares in low-income neighborhoods. But gradually, it had evolved into something more systematic. He had a network of contacts, a tow truck driver who would respond to calls for stranded parents, a pediatrician who would see sick children without insurance questions, a grocery store manager who would mysteriously find reasons to give away food that was about to expire. "It's not charity," Michael said carefully. "It's just making sure that people who are doing their best to take care of others don't have to do it completely alone." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. For 8 years, she had prided herself on her independence, on her ability to handle everything that came her way without asking for help. But sitting across from Michael, she realized that accepting support didn't make her weak. It made her human. "The partnership meeting," she said suddenly, glancing at her watch. "I have to go. My boss wants to see me about leaving Chicago early." Michael's expression grew concerned. "Will you be in trouble?" "Probably," Sarah admitted. "I've been working toward this promotion for 5 years, and walking out of that client meeting was professional suicide. But Emma needed me more than Morrison and Associates did. What if I told you that James Morrison's daughter goes to the same school as Lily?" Michael said with a slight smile. "And what if I mentioned that he's been looking for an associate who understands the importance of family priorities?" Sarah stared at him. "Are you saying you know my boss?" "I'm saying that good parents recognize other good parents," Michael replied. "And sometimes the consequences we expect aren't the ones we get." Sarah walked back to her office with her mind spinning. The conversation with Michael had left her feeling hopeful and unsettled in equal measure. Emma had family now, people who might choose to love her not because they had to, but because they wanted to. But that possibility also meant vulnerability, the chance for new kinds of disappointment and loss. The Morrison and Associates building rose 30 floors above downtown Boston, all glass and steel and the kind of architectural ambition that was supposed to inspire confidence in clients who paid $500 an hour for legal advice. Sarah had always loved the view from the 23rd floor, the way the city spread out below like a promise of possibility. But today, riding the elevator up to James Morrison's corner office, she felt like she was ascending toward judgment. Morrison was waiting for her with a manila folder open on his desk, and an expression that revealed nothing. He was a man in his early 60s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, with the kind of presence that made junior associates stutter and opposing counsel take notes. Sarah had always respected him, but she had never felt like she really knew him beyond his professional reputation. "Sit down, Sarah," he said, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. "We need to talk about Chicago." Sarah sat and clasped her hands in her lap, preparing herself for the conversation that would probably end her career at the firm. "I know I left the meeting early," she began. "My daughter was sick, and I—" "Made exactly the choice I would have made," Morrison interrupted. "The choice any good parent would have made." Sarah blinked, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry." Morrison leaned back in his chair and smiled, the first genuinely warm expression she had ever seen from him. "Sarah, I've been watching your work for 5 years. You're one of the most dedicated attorneys this firm has ever employed. You work late, you exceed every expectation, and you never complain about the sacrifices this job requires. But last week, when your daughter needed you, you chose her over a client meeting. Do you know what that tells me?" "That I'm not partnership material?" Sarah said weakly. "That you have your priorities straight," Morrison replied. "The Chicago client was impressed, not disappointed. They said anyone who would put their child's welfare above a business meeting was someone they wanted representing their company. They specifically requested that you handle their account going forward. Sarah felt the room tilt slightly. I don't understand. Morrison opened the manila folder and slid a document across the desk. Congratulations, Sarah. You made partner. The vote was unanimous. For a moment, Sarah couldn't speak. She stared at the partnership agreement, at her name printed in bold letters at the top of the page, and felt 8 years of careful professional planning crystallize into this impossible moment. But you thought that being a good mother would make you a bad lawyer, Morrison said gently. But some of us believe the opposite is true. My daughter Emily is 7 years old, and she has a friend named Lily Harrison. They go to the same school, and their fathers have had some interesting conversations at pickup. Sarah's eyes widened as the pieces clicked into place. Michael Harrison. He didn't ask me to do anything for you, Morrison said quickly. In fact, he doesn't know about this promotion at all. But our conversations about single parenting and work-life balance helped me realize that this firm needed to do better by attorneys who are also parents. Your partnership comes with flexible scheduling, full family health coverage, and a commitment that we will never ask you to choose between your daughter and your career again. Sarah felt tears threatening for the second time that day. I don't know what to say. Say you'll accept, Morrison said with a smile. And say you'll consider heading up our new family law division. We think your experience as a single mother gives you insights that our clients need. Sarah walked out of Morrison's office in a daze, clutching the partnership agreement and trying to process how completely her life had changed in the span of 6 hours. She called Emma's school and arranged to pick her up early, then sent a text to Michael. You were right about unexpected consequences. Thank you. His response came immediately. Congratulations, partner. Lily and I would like to take you and Emma to dinner this weekend to celebrate, if you're ready for that. Sarah typed back. We're ready. That evening, Sarah and Emma sat in their small kitchen while Sarah tried to explain how their family had suddenly gotten bigger. Emma listened with the kind of intense focus that 8-year-olds brought to really important information, asking questions that cut straight to the heart of things adults preferred to dance around. So Uncle Michael is Grandpa's other son? Emma asked, carefully working through the relationship. That's right. And I have a cousin named Lily who plays piano. She does. Emma considered this for a long moment. Why didn't Grandpa tell us about them? Sarah chose her words carefully. Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that hurt people they love because they think it will hurt less than the truth. Grandpa loved Uncle Michael and his mother, but he also loved us, and he didn't know how to love both families without making everyone sad. That's silly, Emma said with the clarity that children brought to complicated situations. Love doesn't run out. The more people you love, the more love you have. Sarah smiled and pulled her daughter into a hug. You're absolutely right, and I think Uncle Michael and Lily are going to discover that you're a very smart little girl. Will they like me? Emma asked, and Sarah heard the vulnerability beneath the question. They're going to love you, Sarah said with certainty, because you're lovable, and because family chooses to love each other. That weekend, they met at a restaurant in Harvard Square that specialized in comfort food and had a children's menu that didn't require sophisticated palates. Michael arrived with Lily, a serious little girl with dark curls and her father's thoughtful eyes. She shook Emma's hand formally and informed her that she could play Für Elise, but was still working on Moonlight Sonata. Emma was impressed and announced that she was learning to paint watercolors and had recently mastered riding her bike without training wheels. Within minutes, the two girls were deep in conversation about school and friends and the relative merits of various cartoon characters, while Sarah and Michael watched with the amazement that parents felt when their children navigated social situations with more grace than most adults. They're going to be trouble together, Michael observed, as the girls conspired over dessert menus. The best kind of trouble, Sarah agreed. Over dinner, they talked about practical things, how often they might get the girls together, whether they wanted to establish regular Sunday dinners, how to navigate holidays and birthdays, and all the small logistics that turned strangers into family. But underneath the planning, Sarah felt something deeper taking root. For the first time since Emma was born, she wasn't carrying the weight of parenthood entirely alone. As they were preparing to leave, Lily tugged on Sarah's sweater and looked up at her with Michael's earnest expression. "Aunt Sarah," she said carefully, testing out the title. "Will you and Emma come to my recital next month? I'm playing 2 songs, and I want you to hear them." Sarah's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "We wouldn't miss it." Walking back to their car, Emma slipped her hand into Sarah's and squeezed tight. "I like having a big family," she said simply. "Me too," Sarah replied, looking back at Michael and Lily walking toward their own car. "Me too." 3 months later, Sarah's apartment had acquired several new features. A second piano bench — Lily insisted on giving Emma lessons — a collection of children's books in both English and the bits of Mandarin that Michael was teaching both girls, and a refrigerator covered with photos from their Sunday dinners and weekend adventures. The girls had become inseparable, and Sarah and Michael had settled into the comfortable rhythm of co-parenting extended family. On a Tuesday evening in January, Sarah was helping Emma with homework when her daughter looked up from her math worksheet with a question that had clearly been brewing for weeks. "Mummy, do you think Uncle Michael is lonely?" Sarah paused in her review of multiplication problems. "What makes you ask that?" "He always makes sure Lily and I are happy, and he takes care of you when you're stressed about work, but I never see anyone taking care of him." Out of the mouths of babes. Sarah thought. Emma had identified something that Sarah herself had been noticing. Michael's complete focus on everyone else's needs, his careful attention to making sure others felt supported and included, paired with a kind of emotional self-sufficiency that suggested he had learned not to expect the same care in return. "Some people show love by taking care of others," Sarah said carefully. "Uncle Michael is one of those people." "But everybody needs someone to take care of them sometimes," Emma insisted with 8-year-old wisdom. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah found herself thinking about the letter that had started everything. Michael had been writing anonymous notes to strangers, offering support and encouragement to parents who needed to know they weren't alone. But who was writing letters to Michael Harrison? Who was reminding him that he deserved the same kindness he gave so freely to others? The answer, Sarah realized, might be simpler than she had expected. Sometimes the people who take care of everyone else need someone brave enough to take care of them in return. And sometimes that someone had been sitting right across from them all along, too cautious to risk the friendship they had built by hoping for something more. The next Tuesday, Sarah left work early and drove to the elementary school where both girls took their after-school art class. She found Michael in the parking lot, leaning against his car and reading while he waited for pickup time. When he saw her approaching, he smiled with the genuine pleasure that had become familiar over the past few months. "This is a nice surprise," he said, closing his book and giving her his full attention. "Everything okay?" "I wanted to ask you something," Sarah said, suddenly nervous in a way that reminded her of middle school crushes and first dates. "Emma's birthday is next month, and she wants to have a small party. Just family. I was wondering if you'd like to help me plan it." "Of course," Michael said immediately. "I'd love to help. What did you have in mind?" "Actually," Sarah said, taking a breath and stepping into the possibility that had been growing between them for months. "I was thinking about something bigger than just the party. I was wondering if you'd like to help me plan a lot of things. Together." Michael's expression shifted from friendly interest to something deeper, more careful. "Sarah, I know this is complicated," she said quickly. "We have the girls to think about, and our friendship, and all the history that brought us together. But Emma asked me last night if I thought you were lonely, and it made me realize that I've been lonely too, even surrounded by all the family we've built together." "What are you saying?" Michael asked quietly. "I'm saying that I've fallen in love with the man who leaves anonymous letters for struggling parents, who teaches my daughter Mandarin words, and makes sure I eat lunch when I'm working too hard. I'm saying that if you're interested in exploring what this could be beyond friendship and co-parenting, I'd like to try." Michael was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that transformed his entire face and made her understand why Grace Harrison had fallen in love with his father all those years ago. "I've been writing letters to strangers for 3 years, he said, stepping closer. "But I never thought I'd be brave enough to write the most important letter of all, the one that asks the person you love if they might love you back." "Consider it written," Sarah said, and when he kissed her in the elementary school parking lot, while other parents picked up their children and life continued around them, she felt like the brave princess from Emma's bedtime stories, the one who had traveled very far from her castle and finally found her way home. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the back garden of their new house, bigger than her old apartment, with room for 2 pianos and a proper dining table that could seat the family they were still becoming. Emma and Lily were chasing fireflies in the gathering dusk, while Michael grilled vegetables and told them stories about the constellations appearing overhead. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. "Found your letter at the airport today. Thank you for reminding me I'm not alone. A grateful single dad." She smiled and showed the message to Michael. They had continued his letter-writing project together, expanding it to include not just airports, but libraries, community centers, anywhere that parents might need a reminder that someone understood their struggles. The letters were signed "From Someone Who Knows" now, and they included Sarah's business card with a note that legal advice was available for family situations, no questions asked about ability to pay. Another one found its way to the right person, Michael said, reading over her shoulder. "They always do," Sarah replied, watching their daughters discover the magic of summer evenings and extended family and the kind of love that shows up consistently, day after day, in small acts of kindness and grand gestures of commitment. Later that night, after the girls were asleep and the dishes were done, Sarah and Michael sat on their back porch and talked about ordinary things, weekend plans and grocery lists, and the small details that made up a shared life. But underneath the mundane conversations, Sarah felt the deeper current of gratitude for the series of coincidences and choices that had brought them together. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't missed that flight?" she asked. "Every day," Michael admitted. "But then I remember that some things are meant to happen, even when they happen in ways we never could have planned." Sarah smiled and leaned against his shoulder, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, another parent was struggling through a difficult day, wondering if anyone understood the weight they carried. But tomorrow, they might find a letter that reminded them they weren't alone, that family could be created as well as inherited, and that love had a way of finding people who were brave enough to leave it behind for others to discover. The letter under the airport seat had been just the beginning. But every ending, Sarah had learned, was also a new beginning in disguise.